My friends, good evening. I'm going to tell you a story with a rather incredible sequence and terrible consequences. It's January 1989 at Heathrow Airport. Towards the end of the day, there's a Boeing 737-400 coming out of the factory. Literally, it has 500 flight hours and is about to leave for Belfast Island with 126 people on board. The aircraft lines up on the runway, takes off, and is handed over from one controller to another. And finally, he is given clearance to climb to flight level 350, that's about 35,000 feet. As the aircraft is nearing the end of its climb, it has just passed flight level 280. Suddenly, it is shaken by terrible vibrations. And there's a burning smell, a smell of rubber and burning oil that starts to seep into the cabin. They're noticed by the passengers and the pilots. There are two pilots on the plane who are not very familiar with the 737-400. You see, it's an aircraft they just recently received. Even though the captain has 13,000 flight hours and was used to other planes, including the 737-200, he's not very experienced. He only has 23 flight hours on the 300. And as for the co-pilot, this is his first plane. He only has his flight instruments for that. The passengers, in addition to the vibrations and the smell of smoke, see something else. Looking out the left windows, they see the engine spewing dozens of meters of flames behind it. So, they see these flames that sometimes appear intermittently, sometimes they disappear and then come back even stronger. A few seconds later, in the cockpit, the pilots, as is completely normal, will disconnect the autopilot. During this flight, it was the co-pilot sitting on the right who was flying this leg. That means he was the one who performed the takeoff. He was the one flying the plane, and the other was the monitored pilot whom the captain was supposed to monitor. Now, when the emergency occurs, the captain takes over without directly verbalizing it. But this time he does two things. He disconnects the autopilot and he disconnects the autothrottle. That's something completely normal. We expect from a pilot who is facing an emergency that he would start by disconnecting the automation and taking control. We're talking here about the Boeing philosophy, of course, so he takes control and turns to the co-pilot. He asks him, which engine is it, which engine has failed, and the co-pilot will answer. It's the big one on the right one. Actually, he said left, then he swallowed the word left and changed his mind. He said right. What was this assessment based on? It's a total mystery. Actually, right in front of them, on the dashboard, there were the engine indicators, and indeed, the readings for the left engine were extremely erratic. Its temperature was very high, without those towers. Everything related to rotation was fluctuating a bit, and what was fluctuating even more was the fuel flow, the amount of fuel it was consuming. It was fluctuating, showing that the control system was trying to achieve a stable speed but couldn't get it, so it kept opening and closing the fuel. And this caused, on top of everything else, vibrations and an unstable speed. The captain then takes the throttle of engine number 2, the right one, and pulls it back when he pulls it back. Both pilots notice that the vibrations have decreased. There are fewer vibrations. Suddenly things seem to be getting back to normal. That's when it happens. They are interrupted by a radio call and tell the controller, we have an emergency and need to divert. And then they're given vectors to East Midlands Airport. They have to. They were 20 nautical miles away and told themselves they'd cover 36 kilometers to reach the airport as quickly as possible. Once they finished the conversation with the air traffic controller, they shut down the right engine. So the right engine is shut down at this point, and remember, the problem is with the left engine, but it's the right engine that was shut down. Now, the question we can ask ourselves is why, when they reduced the throttles, why did they reduce the right throttle? the vibration stopped or at the very least decreased significantly. Why? In reality, we're not comparing things equally. When you want to compare two situations, you have to change only one parameter. It's important if you want to compare two situations, before and after. I don't change two parameters, I change only one, and only then can I compare. But the reality is that there were two different parameters. Which ones? It's that before and after we had also cut off the auto throttle. Well, yes, so the auto throttle was cut off. What does the auto throttle do? Since it's a system that was trying to manage the thrust of the engines, well, when the left engine, the one that was damaged, was losing power, it tended to move the corresponding throttle forward to give it more power. And when that engine suddenly came back to life and started delivering power, started delivering thrust, the auto throttle would cut power. So what did we have left? We had an unstable engine, and we had the auto throttle, which was sending it commands that it couldn't really handle, constantly sending commands, orders to increase and decrease power, and this engine that was malfunctioning. Well, it couldn't handle those commands, and the more commands it received, the more it multiplied the fluctuations. If you want, we weren't making a comparison. Actually, the vibrations decreased, not because we reduced throttle 2, but because we removed the auto throttle. But since it happened at the same time, the pilots didn't even think about the auto throttle. That's how it was for them. As soon as we reduced throttle 2, well, obviously it's that I reduced the throttle, things get better, so that's what they thought. The pilots shut off the fuel valve for number 2. And so the engine is shut down, so they continue with the others during the descent, since it's an emergency descent. They don't need power, so where are the engines? The throttles are pulled back, the right one is shut down, its throttle is at idle, and the left one is not shut down. But its throttle is at idle, also because we don't need it. The problem is that it's an engine that's damaged, but since it's idling now, you don't feel that there's a problem with it. The problems will only show up when we need to add more power. We don't need it because we're making an emergency descent. On a normal descent, it's common to have some level-offs. At some point, the controller clears an aircraft to descend, and then it must level off at a specific altitude. That's when the jet engines come in. Except that, during an emergency descent, the pilots go from flight level 280 all the way to landing without having to level off. And that's going to play a role in this. During descent, a flight attendant approaches and says, "Gentlemen, I'm sorry to bother you." But the passengers are a little worried, a little panicked because they saw flames and all that. "Would you mind making a little announcement to reassure them?" So the captain indeed takes the public address system and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, as you may have seen, we had a problem with the right engine, which started vibrating and maybe even spitting flames and all that, and we shut it down." So, the flight attendants don't pay attention to the content of the message. They saw it was the left engine with the same problem, except for the message content. They didn't follow it closely. They knew the general content because she was the one who requested it, but as for the details, they didn't follow it. They were busy making sure everything was secure and everyone wore their seatbelt. The passengers, on their part, noticed that there was indeed a problem with what the captain said, but they're just passengers. I mean, if the captain says something, you can either think he made a mistake, maybe that's it. He meant left, but said right, and maybe he doesn't even know anymore. And then, can you imagine, a passenger would feel extremely uncomfortable in such a situation to call a flight attendant and say, "Listen, I think the captain made a mistake." He might hear some not very polite remarks in such a situation. There's an emergency, so we'll just tell him to fasten his seatbelt and be quiet, to put it nicely. So, there's a separation between the cabin and the cockpit. And what's terrible about this accident is that the passengers know more than the pilots. So the plane keeps descending, and then there you go, they're given vectors. It lines up to catch the instrument landing system runway axis, which is the instrument landing system. It's around 8 post-meridian, it's January, so it's already dark. And then the pilots decide that it would be wise to wait until relatively late before starting to lower the landing gear. The flaps, the landing gear, all of that, because he wants to be on the ground as quickly as possible. So there's no question of slowing down far before the runway and making a long, endless approach. The goal isn't that. It's to go for it, full speed ahead. And at some point when they're roughly at 2,000 feet, right? There you go, the captain says to the co-pilot. Go ahead, set the flaps to 15. Before they were at 5, so not much drag. But now the co-pilot is going to take the lever and then click, he's going to set it to 15 at the back of the wings. Large surfaces will begin deploying. They screw in forward, which pushes them outward. So, give me the landing gear too. So take the lever, click, landing gear, bam, the gears come out. So what do we need then? Well, we need to give it a bit of throttle because at that moment you have to add a bit of power to keep the plane from dropping like an iron. So the captain pushes and still in manual and he hasn't put it back yet. The autopilot pushes the throttle lever of number 1, so the left engine. And at that moment, he gets a fire alarm on the left side and the vibrations start up again even stronger. It's only at that moment when he's at 1,000 feet dirty, just 300 meters above the ground, that he realizes he probably made a mistake with that engine. He shut down the wrong engine and the co-pilot says to him, "Do you want me to shut down the engine?" She says, "No, it's fine. We've shut down enough engines for today. Let's stop. Start engine number 2 for me." So, since the auxiliary power unit had been started, and the auxiliary power unit will provide compressed air to start the engines. So, now the co-pilot is going to comply, but he's going to do it very poorly. That means that later, when we find the aircraft's dashboard, right? We'll see that, for example, the button that is used to distribute the force or the pneumatic flow to the engines, from the auxiliary power unit, it was closed, it didn't open, so the co-pilot probably pressed the start button and set it to ground, except that the right engine didn't accelerate at all. It didn't move because the compressed airflow wasn't reaching it. Something else still had to be done. That being said, and according to the investigation report, this didn't change much. It was too late anyway, because when the captain told him, "Start this damn engine for me," we're 50 seconds before impact, so there's really not enough time to see this engine start. To show a stable revolutions per minute, push the throttles and get thrust. No, that's not possible. So the procedure is carried out, but it's carried out poorly. And the reality is that the right engine wasn't even starting. It didn't even start turning. The captain's seeing the ground coming up fast. What does he do? Do you see his seat? He pushes engine 1 to full power. There's no choice. He even thinks it's vibrating and emitting smoke and flames. I don't care. If it can cushion my fall, why not? Why not push it to full power? The vibrations of the plane are so strong at that moment that those doors, the overhead compartments, open up and suitcases and backpacks and everything start raining down in the cabin, start falling on people. To show how strong the vibrations were at that moment. At one point, the captain grabs the radio and yells at everyone, telling them, "Attention, crash landing, basically saying, we're going to crash. That's one of the worst messages you can get, that you can hear on a flight, on a commercial flight. So 10 seconds later, the plane will fly over the M1 highway and then hit the edge of it. Bounce, break into 3 pieces, and then that's it. Calm will return. The firefighters will intervene. They'll come from the airport. They'll come from the neighboring towns. At one point, there were as many as 70 ambulances at the scene. There are the military, civilians as well, and also motorists on the highway who will stop to lend a hand. An extraordinary stroke of luck is that, and this is maybe unlike what we saw with the Sukhoi Superjet in Moscow, it's that the landing gear of the Boeing 737-400 behaved exactly as it should have in such a situation. it broke cleanly. There are very specific breaking points without ever rupturing the fuel tank. Because the plane had just started its flight, there was enough fuel to create hell in there. And actually, there was no fire except for a small fire that started on one engine. And then it stopped. There was no fire that day. So what happened is that the firefighters started to free people from the wreckage. The total for the night was roughly 47 deaths still. Out of the 126 passengers, the last one, the crash happened around 8 p.m. and the last person was freed from the wreckage after 4 a.m. And then, that's it. The investigation will now begin. The aircraft is equipped with a cockpit voice recorder which records 30 minutes of cockpit voices, and it was also equipped with a digital flight data recorder which records 63 flight parameters. And that's what made it possible to piece together the story a little bit. What we discovered later was that the left engine, one of the blades, which was numbered 17-1 of the blades made of a certain compound, broke when it was passing through flight level 280. It broke off, it tore away, and actually it hit against the engine cowling and at the air intake. It stayed there, stuck in an unstable position. What it did later, around landing, what it did was it broke loose, it went back through the engine, and there, a blade, it's a metal object that's very hard, and when it goes through and starts hitting other blades, it creates a cascading failure. And so a failure occurred, and then many blades broke and were ejected, actually, onto the path that had been flown over. If we look at the flight of this Boeing and trace it back, we'll find pieces of metal up to 3 kilometers upstream. That means that over the last 3 kilometers before the impact, the 737 was spitting out pieces from the left engine. The investigation concluded that the pilots acted hastily. The investigators didn't understand why the pilots didn't interpret the instruments that were in front of them, because they clearly showed all the instabilities I mentioned. Engine instability, high temperature, fuel flow instability. All of that was clearly evident on the left engine's instrument panel, while the right engine's panel didn't show such instability. All the needles were stable. But the reality is that there was probably a kind of tunnel vision at that moment. The co-pilot said it was the right engine that failed, and we pulled back the throttle, and suddenly things seemed to calm down, right? All the symptoms that started this whole situation seemed to calm down. Well, from that moment on, we decided it was the left engine. And don't forget that we weren't comparing two equal situations, but we had also cut off the auto throttle, which was a factor of instability in this case. Anyway, that's it. I was just telling this story because it reminded me of this one. Because of the GJR, where the pilots shut down the engine, the wrong engine, so the one that was working, the GJR, they shut it down at low altitude. Isn't that the one they shut it down? At flight level 280, you can imagine that if you shut down an engine at flight level 280, you still have a chance, right, to be able to restart it? But the problem is that the failure, he shut it down. Yes, at high altitude, that's true. If they had detected the failure earlier, they would have had their chance. Except that there was, in particular, this isolation between the cabin, where people knew it was the left engine, and the cockpit, where people didn't know that the engine had failed. And this meant that the error remained hidden, concealed, and was only detected a few seconds before it was too late. Thank you, my friends, for watching this video until now, and I'll see you in the next one.